Good morning, everybody, and welcome to another UKAA webinar on build-to-rent industry specific issues. Of course, this is part of our ongoing program of bringing best practice to the industry, making the industry aware of issues that are out there, and more importantly, how to solve them if they do need solving. Today, I am very, very pleased to be joined by Emma Vigus of Aon Real Estate and James Didcott, also of AOS, but also Andrew Jones, who's the Director of Aqua Leak Detection, which is the subject matter of today's webinar. This is a huge issue for our industry, because it talks not just to the design side, but it talks to the construction side, and it talks to a perception out there that when there is a leak, somehow there's a magic insurance policy to solve that leak or to solve that problem. And whilst these policies may exist, they're not necessarily easy, and they're often not the easiest things to gain in terms of cost, the price of insurance. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Emma, who will chair the session and to talk you through this really, really important issue for our industry. Emma, over to you.
Lovely. Thank you very much, Brendan, and good morning, everybody. You'll have to excuse me if my throat is a little croaky. I've managed to come out of the bank holiday weekend with a cold. First of all, I just wanted to ask Andrew and James both to just introduce yourselves, please. So Andrew, if you'd like to go first. Andrew, you're on mute. Oh, James.
Sorry about that.
Thank you.
Terribly sorry. My name's Andrew Jones, and I'm a director at Aqua Leak Detection, and I'm responsible for business development. And we're a company that supply all different manners of leak detection systems, monitoring, and so on and so forth across the residential, commercial, and industrial space.
Thank you, Andrew. And James, if you'd like to introduce yourself and perhaps just give a little bit of an explanation of what your role is at Aon as head of our claims team.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, so I'm James Didcott. I am from Aon Real Estate. I've actually worked in the industry in Aon for coming up to 23 years. So my role at Aon is I'm the real estate claims director. So I have overall operational control of what we do for our clients, from claims processing to large losses to reviewing MI and looking at potential risk management initiatives to help our clients, reduce the number of claims under their policy. I've got an excellent team of 6 that work for me, and we're scattered across the UK. So we've got reach across all of the UK when needed. And also we've become involved in European losses and some losses outside of the US, such as Mexico and Australia.
Lovely, thank you, James. So in summary, you're really seeing this from the front line in terms of the clients whose properties and assets we insure.
Correct. Yeah.
Great. Thank you, James. Thank you. So I think just to start, I'm just going to start by putting a little bit of context around why this is such an important topic, both in terms of the quality of customer experience within build to rent. Nobody wants to be living in a home that's having problems with escape of water, but also in the context of the impact that this has on insurance. So I think there's a great deal of focus at the moment on cost management and whether or not that leads to an impact on the quality of the assets that are being constructed. But certainly in terms of the cost of claims arising from escaping water to insurers, in Q4 of last year, so the Association of British Insurers recorded property insurance claims arising from escape of water or water leaks at £368 million. So that was what was paid out, and that was the highest level ever recorded. And understandably, what that means is that insurers are going to be looking to recoup those losses through the premiums that actually we pay both as homeowners, but also that the investors in and operators of build to rent pay. Andrew, James, I just want to ask as the sort of first question, if there's one thing you want our audience to take away from today, what is that one thing? Andrew, if you'd like to go first, please.
Yeah, sure. So I think from our perspective, I think it's really just creating an awareness and encouraging those on the call today to really consider their approach to mitigating the risks of water leaks from the sort of the earliest stage, really. So from design or M&E specification stage. I think, what we often see in our position is clients coming to us, after a building is occupied, they're experiencing problems, they're seeing leaks, they've had a catastrophic leak, and then it's sort of a retrofit scenario. And I think what we're keen to do, not just from an installation of technology point of view, but from a general approach to building design, plumbing systems, is to encourage that early thought, so that the earlier you consider those things, the easier it is to implement the sort of the necessary approaches to minimise those leaks. There's a number of good practice guides and best practice guidance out there from the insurance industry that can lead you in that direction. But I think the main thing is just that early consideration and awareness of your approach to leak detection to minimise those risks.
That's great. Thank you, Andrew. So in summary, really design in your approach to minimising escape of water right from the outset.
Mm-hmm.
Don't think about it after the worst has happened.
Yeah.
Exactly. And James, what's the one thing that you want the audience to take away from today?
I think mine's pretty simple. I think know your risk, know your property, because I think that, from a claims perspective, we've seen a lot of claims go poorly, simply because the person who's managing the property doesn't know the simple things like where's the stopcock, or where do I turn off the water leak, or who do I contact if there's a problem. So I think the message from me is going to be know your risk. It's important to know your risk, and from the point where we try and, you're working with people to place a policy. Insurers want the confidence that your property, and from a claims perspective, if you do unfortunately have an incident, the key is immediate response and making sure we can do the right things immediately to reduce the cost of that claim. So know your risk. That's my message.
That's brilliant. Thank you, James. And James, continue on from that. Do you have any specific, fairly recent examples of our clients suffering a major loss as a result of escape of water, and if yes, what were the consequences of that?
I've probably got two examples. I've got one bad experience and I've got one good experience. So I'm going to start with the bad, and the bad one that I had was actually over the Christmas period quite recently, whereby a property was vacant. The landlord owner had a property management company in place, and they didn't sign off on what needed to be doing during the winter period, and therefore on Christmas Eve the pipes froze. They then burst, and the property manager didn't believe they had the authority to shut down the water, so they didn't. And the client thought that the onus was on the property manager to shut down. So effectively, we had 48 hours of continual water leaking through the property. And on the base, luckily, because it was vacant, in some respect, the damage, we didn't have an impacted tenant. We didn't have any loss of rent issues, which can increase escape of water claims, but simply because they didn't manage the risk or know how to manage the property or have open dialogue and conversations, that claim escalated dramatically, well over £1 million as a result of that incident. And then the good news one for me is actually a couple of weeks ago in the student accommodation setup, there was a water leak, I believe, on the 14th floor. Now that could be catastrophic. You imagine 14 floors with the number of student accommodations that are underneath it coming down. But because the property manager acted swiftly, knew the property, got the plans out, knew where to stop the leaks, knew where to turn off the water, actually that loss reduced down, and we managed to keep the amount of water that leaked to a minimum. Yes, there has been damage. Yes, it is expensive. You knock a glass of water over your table, it's only a little glass, it can go on forever and end up everywhere. But we managed to immediately react, and what's been good there is that due to the plans that they had in place that we worked with them on, that we've managed to start the repairs, and the repair works have already started. So that's great news there. So two different scenarios
Thank you, James. But I think that's a fantastic example of the importance, as you said in your opening statement, of getting the basics right, just having that protocol in place in response to a major incident. And James, can I just ask, in the student block that you mentioned, how did they detect the escape of water? Did somebody report it, or did they have leak detection in place?
There was no leak detection. There was no leak detection system. It was reported by a student.
Okay, lovely. Thank you, James. And Andrew, your sort of recent examples of catastrophic leaks, please.
Yeah, so as you can imagine, as a company like ours, we tend to see people come to us when the worst has happened. So a couple of examples that we've, one anecdotal that we've heard, and one that we've been asked to go in and replace and install leak detection after the event. But the first one being a major developer who had a leak on the 33rd or 34th floor shortly before practical completion, about 2 weeks before practical completion. And then the first they were aware was that leak had made it all the way down to the ground. So a claim in the sort of region of £10 million, which is obviously a significant amount, plus the delays that then went for that building in terms of getting it occupied and operational. I think the one where we've actually gone in and installed a system after the event happened was where in a residential block there was some booster pumps installed in the plant of that building. The booster pumps were changed for a reason I'm not sure, but they were changed, and that changed the water pressure. And because of the hammer effect that was then being caused because of those booster pumps, it caused some poorly installed loose pipe work to come loose from the at high level, and that then caused significant amount of damage. And it was only flowing for about 15 minutes. But they had to replace two lift shafts. So you can imagine the costs involved in replacing those lift shafts. The associated technology was quite significant. So yeah, we see everything from those down to the individuals coming to us who have experienced significant leaks in their home, that can see people displaced for anywhere from 3 months to 9 months and beyond, really, depending on the level of damage. So yeah, we sort of see every different type of leak.
And Andrew, how much harder is it to retrospectively install leak detection compared with designing it in right from the outset? And I guess also as well, what's the cost implication of trying to install after the event?
Yeah, so I mean, you can, it is possible to retrofit leak detection, and because of the type of technology, so flow-based technology, you're talking about the installation of systems on incoming mains. So with that regard, it's fairly straightforward. However, there's different types of leaks. So if it's a burst, then that's very effective. However, if it's a drip, then you require more of a sort of contact sensor based. They're very difficult to install after the event. They're best at new build or refurbishment stage. Whereas actually where you want those sensors in place is from the outset. If you've got an occupied property, and the finish has been made, you're then talking about installing sensors around a property. You can install wireless sensors, but ultimately you'd still want to have you'd be doing some work to the property, so the cost implications of them making good that installation of the sensor-based side of things is much higher. Flow-based will offer you a level of protection, and particularly in build-to-rent residential sector, I think flow-based is typically been seen as the sort of the preferred, if you like, in that area. What we're seeing now is developers coming to us saying we want to cover both bases. We want to have that sensor-based element, but also the flow-based element. And so that really is best at sort of the new build or refurbishment stage, so you can really get access to those areas that need the sensors installing.
Thank you, Andrew. And James, I mentioned the figure at the beginning from the ABI in terms of the cost of losses arising from escape of water in the last quarter of last year. How are insurers viewing the level of claims they're seeing at the moment, and what impact does that have on premium, excess, but also the guidance or the steps that insurers want to see implemented to mitigate the likelihood of a claim arising?
Okay. So I think obviously I'm from the claims background, but we're heavily involved with our team in London and our brokers when we're either renewing policies or with a new risk is coming on. Escape of water, I think the ABI also said that escape of water is the #1 cause of property insurance claims as well. So I think that goes to show how much of an issue potentially for insurers escape of water is and things like that. I think from my perspective, what the first thing that they will look at, I think when you're underwriting a current risk, not a new risk, so it's a property that's existing, the first thing they're going to look at is the claims experience. How many claims have been suffered, what are the costs of those claims. We're finding that we're having to provide a lot more detailed information than we have done before around claims, and it's not just around what built up the costs, but it's more the start of it and the end of it. Why did it happen? Why wasn't there maybe a reaction quicker? Why wasn't the leak detection in place? And then at the end, what have you done to mitigate any future claims at the property or similar events? I think the way that I would see it, and taking a very basic approach to this, because I think sometimes we try and think way ahead and maybe we just need to get back to basics, that I think what people need to do is it's around the management of that risk. Is the leak, you need an effective leak protection in place, especially in probably build to rent properties and those type of assets, because you're impacting an individual, you're impacting it's personal, because that's where people live. It gets emotive and people are emotional and things like that. So I think from my perspective, I just think insurers will endeavour to underwrite policies when it involves it, but it's about how you manage your risk. It's making sure that you know your risk and you can sell that risk to the underwriter in saying, look, that the likelihood is in any residential portfolio or build to rent portfolio, you are going to suffer some form of escape of water at some point. I think it's inevitable. I don't think you can get away from that happening, but it's how you deal with it. So how do you deal with it? Have you got the right processes in place? Have you got that leak protection in place? Do you understand your property? And it's making sure that you work with the insurers and work with a broker to ensure that you deliver that message across to the insurers to help reduce premium and help reduce excesses. We're seeing cases now where premiums are escalating, and also we're seeing excesses increase. And unfortunately, when excesses do increase, if you start hitting big excesses, maybe tens and thousands of pounds, who's actually covering the costs underneath that? Is that falling back to the tenant potentially? Is it falling back to the investment company? That somebody's got to fill that gap. So maybe let's work all together to make sure that we deliver a risk that's profitable for everybody.
I think you make some really important points there, James, and the point that stood out for me was actually the emotional impact on the person who lives in that home, and that's so important to build to rent the quality of customer experience. But I think the other point you make as well is around knowing your risk, and certainly I don't work in claims like you do, James. I deal with new clients that are coming into Aon. One of the things that I'm finding is actually investors often don't have a particularly great understanding of the assets that they're taking on. Now, if that's a forward funded asset and they're taking it on at completion, actually, what is the construction process that's gone into developing that? What leak detection systems are in place? What other systems are in place to mitigate likelihood of claims? And equally, if they're purchasing standing stock, again, not a great understanding of the stock that they're actually acquiring. And if they're coming to us sort of a couple of weeks ahead of when they want insurance, that makes our job in terms of presenting that risk to insurers very, very difficult. And that's only going to lead to an increase potentially in insurance rate, but also in excesses.
I think the key is when it comes to renewals or like getting early, I think that information find is absolutely critical. If you are taking on a building from somebody else, you probably don't have the knowledge. So the crucial part there is to get as much information as you can, even down to who fitted the who fitted the taps, that, you know, or who sealed the windows, or who sealed the base, because it's simply, you need to know, because there could be other elements here as well that you have to look at. If an incident does occur, is there a recovery option against somebody from a client's perspective? Can we go back to the original build contractor? You know, did they fail to do their job correctly? So therefore we can look to subrogate against them, which then has a positive impact on the claims experience, because then actually that large loss ends up probably being at a very, very low value because we were able to recover the cost back. And on the emotional point, social media has blew up. We know that over the last couple of years, you know, if somebody is in a property that suffered a water leak and they don't believe that they've been responded to quick enough, or something's happened, it'll be on Twitter, it'll be on Facebook, it'll be on Instagram, it'll end up in a local paper, and before you know it, it's a reputational impact on the property owners.
Just to add to that, Emma, we were recently contacted by a BTR operator who was seeing exactly that. One of their tenants had suffered a leak, and through social media, and the company came to us very concerned about their, you know, their customer reputation, their customer sort of rating scores, and therefore we're very keen to, you know, to address that problem on future buildings as well as the one that had been affected, because, like you say, James, you know, the reputational impact of such a leak can be significant.
Andrew, I do have a quick question for you. I know it's off piece, but I do want to ask a question on the leak protection. Have you seen a move more recently, probably over the coming years, that you're engaged earlier, or still a majority of your contacts after the event? That's what I'm always interested in.
Yeah, there's definitely been a clear shift to earlier engagement. I think this type of technology historically has been a nice to have. But it's then the first thing that's, you know, as Emma alluded to at the beginning about, you know, a cost management perspective was one of the first things that comes out of the budget. What we're seeing now is much more of a move to sort of a portfolio approach from developers who are looking to make themselves more attractive to insurers. So they're looking at this in a much more strategic way, and saying, okay, we've got, you know, X phases of this development. We want to have leak detection across the portfolio, and of course there are then cost reductions that can be achieved that way. So I would say we're still not seeing, you know, there's definitely been a shift towards that early engagement. I think it continues to go, and I think documents such as some of the best practice guidance that's come out from the Construction Insurers Risk Engineers Group, which the listeners might be aware of, also the Risk Authority, both have published best practice guidance looking at how to mitigate escape of water in the SIREG case, the construction phase, and from the Risk Authority's case, the sort of the ongoing operational phase. That's definitely you know, been landing on some people's desks, and it's been encouraging people to think more strategically about it, and that's prompting the early contact with us. And I think but inevitably, you know, I think we're probably all a bit guilty sometimes of, well, we don't want to spend money on something that we think that we hope will never happen, but then of course when it does happen, you know, people sort of wish they'd spent, you know, that initial outlay in the first place. So there's a clear shift though, definitely.
I think it's a really interesting point you made, Andrew, about it being one of the first things to come out of the budget. And you know, if you do a risk matrices, there is a high probability of this happening. That's played out in the figure I gave at the beginning for the losses arising in Q4 2022. And not only is there a high probability, the cost is high, but also, as we've said time and again now on this session, the impact on reputation, and that's particularly important because, as James said, social media, but also because of things like the importance of home views ratings. You know, that's fundamental to your build to rent assets being more appealing than somebody else's. So I suppose I'm disappointed to hear that it's still one of the first things to come out of the budget. So I think anything that's there to mitigate a claim, but also to improve customer experience is so important. But Andrew, just you touched on this in your earlier response, and actually I think you've covered it as well in your response to James's question. but I'm sensing that you're seeing developers' attitudes sort of changing, as you said there in your response to James. It's more often being thought about at the outset. Is that understanding correct?
Yeah, very, very much so. As a, and that is being driven by, by the insurance sector, and by the requirements of insurers. I think there's also, around sort of modern methods of construction and the new way that residential properties are being built. The engagement that we have with insurers, they're placing more requirements on, off-site manufacturing and pod manufacturing, for example, and the concerns around installation and connection of those pods to the sort of the shell and core of the building, if you like. So the developers really are looking at this in a more strategic way. So yeah, there's definitely been that shift, and it's less so. It doesn't come out of the budget quite so quickly anymore. I think there are other things that that are removed first now because of this requirement that's being placed on them by the insurance companies.
And I'm just going to take a pause here to ask the audience if anybody has any questions at this stage. Do take the opportunity to, I think we've got the ability to raise hand or to post your comments into the chat. Okay, doesn't look like we've got anything coming in, but if anybody does have a question, as I say, please do post it in the chat. Andrew, just building on from your response in terms of developers, what pushbacks are you getting? And what are you seeing in terms of the broader steps that people can take to mitigate escape water? So not just installation of leak detection. What generally stops people doing what they need to in terms of managing this risk?
I think the first and foremost is always the capital outlay that's involved in taking any steps that aren't mandatory, that aren't absolutely required. I think we've seen that change because of all the reasons that we've just talked about, whether it be insurance premiums and excesses. There's that sort of the loss of income that can come from not having a property operational. So I think it's always been that, well, we don't want to pay, as I mentioned earlier, we don't want to pay for something that may never happen. In terms of broader steps for mitigating the escape of water, I think I've alluded to the best practice guidance, and they have some really good advice around, so for example, at the construction phase, looking at the implementation of water management plans and looking at testing regimes to absolutely make sure that those buildings are built. And I think this goes back to the sort of the construction quality issue. I think sometimes there's been those types of best practice guidance can fall between two stools, and maybe the client can sometimes think, if the developer hasn't instructed us to take that into consideration, they haven't done it. But there's been almost an assumption that those build quality elements are just taken on board as normal. So I think sometimes that can lead to a bit of a disjuncture on who's responsible for that build quality. But I think in terms of other risk mitigation, insurance companies have been issuing their best practice guidance and tips for quite some time now around shutting off the water when properties are empty. Going back to James's point about that, just awareness of the risk, knowing where the stopcock is, how to turn the water off, and I guess as much as you can put in, an autonomous way of switching the water off, that's always a positive too. So I think there are a number of different ways in which that consideration can be given, both at the construction phase, but then also at the occupied phase too.
Thank you, Andrew. And James, just leading on from that, you talked earlier about two examples. When you see claims, James, what typically is what typically are the root causes? So obviously the water has escaped. How? Yeah. Why?
I think the main of the escape of water is normally, and probably the most frustrating one for me, is loose connections. that, you know, that something hasn't been, you know, the pipe hasn't been connected correctly, or the sealant's failed, or and they're probably the most annoying ones for me, because that's a quality check. You know, I've just mentioned earlier before everyone joined the call, I've actually suffered a water leak myself overnight, and it's come down to the fact that the plumber didn't connect the pipe correctly. So you know, and the amount of damage that can potentially cause is quite horrific, because you've got to find the element. I think with older properties, you know, when you're talking about older properties, you know, there's a lot of old pipe work. They're in weird and wonderful places. I remember dealing with a claim in London whereby they actually had a rainwater gully that ran through the middle of the property. You know, it went back to something like the 1900s, you know, the way that this property was constructed. So I think the main claim is that we're seeing is around the failure of connections, either because they haven't been connected correctly, or simply because of the age of them. And then the other one as well is, still now, when we get that bad weather and pipes freeze, there is a lot of material out there on how to ensure that your pipes don't freeze, or to stop them from freezing. Because if you can imagine that water freezing and then the pipe effectively bursting, the amount of damage that can cause as well can be catastrophic.
And do those root causes, James, lead through into both you and Andrew have mentioned the risk guidance, for example. Do those root causes lead into the guidance from insurers and the requirements from insurers in terms of what they want to see?
Yeah, I'd say so. I think what insurers want, I think that sometimes we think that insurers are maybe asking, there may be insurers on the call, so I don't want to upset anybody with what I say, but what the point I'm trying to make is that I think they want to know that you know that risk. You know, they want to know that you understand, you know, when things were fitted, you know, who fitted those aspects, especially in the newer properties, because, you know, we should have all that information readily at hand. You know, we're in a document heavy world now, probably, and you know, it doesn't have to sit in a ring binder in an office. It can actually be shared via different platforms and different risk management tools as well. So I think that they want to understand it, and they want to know that there's lessons learned from it. I think that's a key thing when it comes to claims. It's the lesson learned afterwards. I like to sit back after a claim and say, what could we have done differently maybe to stop the incident, but then actually look at what could we have done differently to improve the life cycle of the claim, to maybe reduce some cost here. And I think you always need to take a step back, and it's the lessons learned part as well.
Okay. Thank you, James. And Andrew, in terms of somebody acquiring an asset, whether that's something they forward funded, so they're taking ownership at completion, or acquiring a standing asset, what practical advice can you give on assessing the risk of escape of water within those properties? What are the key things they need to be looking out for?
Yeah, I think this goes back to what James was saying about the sort of the reasons for those leaks, and what we commonly see, you know, as you say, is that poor connection. You know, the poor installation of whether that be the plumbing systems or plumbing to appliances themselves. There was a recent piece of research done by an insurer with a forensic company that talked about how the mastic was reacting with the plastic that the pipework was manufactured from, which was actually causing the damage and the corrosion of the pipework itself. So these things can sometimes just be, you know, sort of unwittingly done, as well as that poor installation, perhaps. So I think it's really, you know, looking at the maintenance. If you're buying taking ownership of an asset, just assessing where possible, you know, the accessibility of those of that pipe work, checking, you know, those connections. I think access is a big point from our point of view, because, you know, if you have leaks behind sealed units and sealed baths and so on and so forth, it's then very difficult to investigate. It's even harder to manually, you know, and sort of personally identify those leaks. So I think access is a big point, and actually being able to get to those points if there are leaks that have occurred. But I think it's really that assessment, the maintenance and the monitoring, you know, of that, you know, of that plumbing and those appliance connections on an ongoing basis.
Thank you. And I think that picks up on a point that James has made several times as well, which is understanding what's happened in the asset before you take ownership of it. So asking the question about the claims experience and the steps that have been taken to mitigate those claims can pinpoint or lead to a much better understanding of risk within that property.
Just to add, I think the other area that's always of risk as well is the soil stacks. So quite a common type of leak that we see is actually a weeping coming from the soil stack, whether that be because it's backed up or a blockage. As I sort of talked about earlier, those are when you need more of a contact sensor or somebody to identify when that soil stack is leaking. You're seeing it through on a floor slab or through a ceiling. So that's another area that people should just be aware of, monitoring those soil stacks for any potential ingress and leaks happening there.
And James, when we talk about emerging technologies and their ability to positively impact claims, quite often in my experience, insurers want to see sort of proof that they actually play an important role. Do we have that proof yet for leak detection systems, or is it a little bit early? Or
I personally, it's a little bit early for me, I think, at the moment, because I think the way you've got to look at a risk is, it's like with anything, if you're trying to improve something, I think the one thing that drives me mad is that people expect that it's going to have that immediate impact. It's going to have that immediate, you put the leak detection in March and all of a sudden you're not going to get, I think there's this, you're not going to get any damage. You're not going to get any more claims. You put your leak detection in, everything's fine. But actually it's a case of the leak detection is there so that we're aware when an incident is about to occur or is occurring. And then by working with that and having the correct claims process in place as well, and property processing, how it's managed, those three things coming together as one will ensure that you reduce probably the number of claims happening, but also more importantly for the insurance industry is reduce the cost that claim actually generates. They've all got to work together. It's great having the leak detection system, but if it triggers, Andrew, and nobody responds, that they're not checking how you respond to it or how the alert comes, then it's making sure it's all about the process. And it's back to my original point, which is knowing your risk. You've got to know your risk. You've got to know what triggers what.
And Andrew, do you work with owners, investors who've installed leak detection systems to help them get those protocols right? Or are you just doing the technology installation?
Yeah, we just look at the technology installations. We don't do the ongoing sort of, the process beyond that from happening. I would agree with James's point that leak detection doesn't make everything go away. It's an early warning sign, and as I mentioned earlier, the introduction of a sort of an autonomous shut off will reduce the value of the claim. It won't stop any water escaping ever. What it does do is it means you don't have, and James, you mentioned an example earlier on about, water flowing for 48 hours in a property. That's when you see the really large catastrophic, claims. But what we can do is get that early warning signal. So either the property manager is addressing it, or there's an autonomous action within the property itself that can just, stop that water from flowing and causing, the extent of the damage.
And I think the system in place, keys we're talking about, build to rent property, this is what we're talking about today. You're building them to rent to people, individuals. One of the great costs to an escape of water claim is either rehousing somebody, loss of rent, or alternative accommodation. So if you've got the leak detection in place, you've triggered it, we've got the process which makes everybody aware. We may just limit the damage, that it's just a redecoration damage rather than a move people out of their properties, find alternative accommodation, and loss of, and the costs then will start to escalate. So it's about all. I think it's everybody coming together clearly on risk management that once it's installed, what is the emergency process plan? If that alarm triggers, if that sensor triggers, what's next? I think that's a question people have got to be asking themselves.
And I think, again, James, you've highlighted there the importance of that customer experience. Yeah. Well, what do you do? What do you do with somebody who actually can't live in their apartment for 2 or 3 weeks? And that highlights an important point about policy lettings, is whether you
and it is, and unfortunately for everybody, water leaks don't happen between 9 and 5 on a Monday to Friday. So, you know, I've had cases where we've had it on Boxing Day, Christmas Day, and the worst one is that you get that leak on a late on a Friday evening, trying to find alternative accommodation can be a problem. So that comes back to that process part in respect of claims, is knowing, right, I've had a leak, who's the emergency point of contact at my loss adjuster, at my broker, who do I speak to help get me the alternative accommodation for these people? Because it's about the customer experience, as well as, if we do it correctly from the outset, we can help reduce the cost of the claim.
Thank you, James. And Andrew, how is the technology going to evolve over the next 2 to 3 years?
I think, I mean, leak detection in and of itself is not new technology, and I think there are only certain ways to detect leaks, if you like. Now, what you're seeing is new ways, so, i.e., ultrasonic versus turbine meters within pipes, so ultrasonic monitoring. The use of AI when it comes to leak detection. So rather than it just being something that's in situ, it's then how you can use algorithms to set leak parameters, how you can then use that information, how you can then get notifications to have remote monitoring. So at the moment, some leaks into those properties go, the point you made about property management and having that remote monitoring, remote access, I think will become increasingly important. Also wireless sensors as well. I think typically systems have been hardwired, whereas it's very much a move now to small wireless sensors, and there are various things on the market that do all of the things I'm talking about this morning. But I think it's the actual detection of leaks themselves. I don't think that there will be sort of huge innovation in that side of things, but it's how the user interfaces and how people can use these products just become more of our sort of everyday lives. So, you have a Ring doorbell, for example. Who would have thought 10 years ago you'd be able to have a doorbell that you can monitor from your phone? So it's just how these leak detection products will sort of evolve to be part of our everyday lives, really.
Thank you. And forgive me, I've completely lost track of where my thinking was going there. I got a great question lined up for you, Andrew, and it's just gone clear out of my head. I'm just going to say again, if the audience has any questions, please do post them in the chat, because I think we're getting towards the point where I think we've covered a lot of the key points. But I suppose, Andrew, the question I was going to ask actually is, do you know roughly what percentage of residential properties have some kind of leak detection system installed? Yeah,
I mean, anecdotally, we say that it's about 1 in 10 new builds, which wow, as a percentage is very low.
Yes.
I think we're seeing more and more if you're talking about the individual residents, so homeowners rather than BTR, we are seeing a lot more adoption being driven by the insurance sector, obviously. But I think at the moment, the adoption in those new multi-apartment blocks is still relatively low, albeit, as I mentioned earlier, that shift means that there are very large developments in London, but also around the country that are having leak detection systems installed, from the very beginning. But it's the adoption is still low, and hence why we're in the sort of phase of education, really, and building the awareness of the issue.
And are these widely adopted in other asset classes? I'm thinking, for example, the hotel sector. Do a lot of hotels have leak detection systems installed?
No, not so much with hotels. I think the commercial and industrial sectors, office space, for example, there won't be many office fit outs, large office fit outs that won't have some element of monitoring and protection. That's when you're monitoring computer assets. And data centers as well is another area that's come in, and it's effectively has it installed as standard, because the cost of having downtime in those types of environments is significant, both from a reputational but also financial point of view. So they need to identify any issues in areas like that where water is so prevalent, with cooling systems and so on and so forth, that you really need to be on top of. If a leak occurs, then you need to know where it is, and you need to be able to address it so that you can minimize the downtime. So less so in hotels, but certainly definitely in office fit outs, data centers, anywhere where there's very high value assets, so laboratories and so on. This is fairly standard now.
It's interesting, but raises an interesting question about the perception of value, which is probably for another discussion. Andrew, we do have a question, which is, I'm going to read this directly, sorry. Have you seen a form of pipe survey service where the state of the pipes can be assessed as a preemptive measure?
No, we haven't. No, it's not something that we've come across at all. But it's a good question.
James, are you aware of anything that might help with that?
I haven't seen anything. I'm willing to do some digging and come back to the group. But I haven't, no, yeah.
Okay.
We'll take that one away, Andrew.
Yeah, good idea. We can definitely take that one away.
The question's actually been raised by one of our colleagues, James. So
No, has it? That's good. That's good.
So I think I'd like to start to wrap up now, if I can, and I'm going to ask each of you. You gave us at the very start of the session the sort of key takeaway that you wanted the audience to leave today with, and I'm going to sort of come back to that question slightly, albeit I'm going to position it a little bit differently, which is, if you could wave a magic wand to improve the situation in relation to escape of water, what would your magic wand do? What's the transformative thing? And Andrew, I'm going to make this hard for you, because I don't think you can just say everybody has to install it.
No, fair enough.
So what do you think the magic wand, or indeed the magic wands, are in relation to this problem?
Well, I do think it comes down slightly to the standards that is required. So, and again, as James said, there may be insurers on the call, so I don't want to upset anybody. But I think what we've seen is that there is a confusion around what is required in terms of what the risk mitigation, and I guess I'm talking specifically from a leak detection perspective, but sometimes the clauses that are placed in insurance policies are very sort of simple and straightforward in saying that there needs to be an automatic shut-off, for example. Whereas I think there's work that I think this idea of coming together, from a risk management perspective, of saying, right, how can we be very clear to whether it be clients or individuals, of what is expected? What is we can't just have, say, one automatic shut-off valve on a property that has several water feeds, but then it becomes a sort of between a box ticking exercise and actually having effective risk mitigation in place. So I think from our perspective, it would be about just developing that standard, which will in turn put some clarity into what's expected of people, what people, we do see that going. My insurers told me we need to install something, but I'm not sure what. And I think if there's a sort of a clearer standard available, then I think that would go a long way to just helping people, point them in the right direction.
Thank you, Andrew. And James, your magic wand.
I haven't got long enough probably to say what I'd like on my wish list, but I think if I'm going to bring it down to a couple of things, I said it from the start, is about knowing is people understanding the risk, and sometimes there can be a high turnover in maybe managing agents or different property management. So it's making sure that handover is clear, so that that secondary person understands the building and making sure enough people understand the property. It's a word, and the next one is a word that I use a lot. And if there's any members of my team on the call, they're probably sick of hearing it. Working partnership with everybody. I think that we're all too much saying all the insurers are on one side of the fence, and then the brokers are there, and the insured's there, and the contractors are there. Why not get together at an early stage? That point on what insurers are actually saying. Is it realistic? And the example you've just explained, Andrew, it isn't realistic that you can just have this. We'd all like to just be able to press a button and shut all the water off, but there could be reasons why you can't. So, you know, why not build a water management project from day one? You know, how are you going to manage it collectively? Broker, owner, you know, risk management advice people, insurers, leak detection people, and how can we come together in a partnership to ensure that the risk, you know, it can be managed and can be managed well. So know your risk and partnership. There's my two.
And I think because build to rent is a relatively new sector,
yeah,
I think this sector has a fantastic opportunity
right.
to develop that partnership
Yeah.
approach to risk management across all forms of risk, whether that's asset level risk or people risk or cyber risk. And that's something that you know, I've mentioned before in other webinars that we've done for the UKAA. I think the key takeaway I've got done is that I think well-used tech, well-used solutions like Aqualeak have a fantastic role to play in risk mitigation. But James, as you've repeatedly highlighted, tech alone is not the only answer. It has to work with the correct protocols. And they always say that the best test of a risk management system is when the worst happens. How do you respond to that, and how do you mitigate the impact of that? And I think that's absolutely fundamental to getting these processes right. And equally, James, as you said, those processes have to flow when there is a change of operator or a change of property manager, or indeed just a change of personnel. And right now,
Right.
that's challenging because we are operating in a sector where we have recruitment and retention challenges. And Brendan, that plays right back to the point you made before we started, which is the vital importance of the property manager. And perhaps we need to start escalating them as the superstars in this industry. So thank you, Andrew. Thank you, James.
No worries. Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Well, thank you very much to all of you for an incredible sort of wide-ranging conversation about the importance of this issue. I mean, it just seems to point to the continuous emergence of the operational brief being critical to not just the building manager, which of course is massively important, but that investors and developers need to recognize that, you know, in the sales world, we sold our risk on and you bought whatever you bought the building and off you went, and you had to manage those things on your own. But when you're looking at build to rent, when you're looking at managing an entire building and perhaps sometimes an entire estate, it's a different ball game. It's a different dynamic. It requires a lot more thinking and a lot more joined up thinking. And if you know, my takeaway from this is this need to be joined up and to consult and to check all the way through. But yes, you're absolutely right, Emma. The building manager they need to be made the rock stars of our industry. There's no other way of putting it. They have such an important job to do for all of us, and I think that's something that in the UKAA we will certainly be looking at and trying to advance their status, and indeed their influence on the process. So I'd just like to thank Andrew, James, and Emma for a fantastic seminar, very educational, very helpful. Again, this will form part of our best practice guide. It will go in as a video submission with a little bit of a write-up on it. Part of our process of bringing high quality knowledge to the industry. So thank you all very, very much. We continue to do this. Our next webinar is a few weeks away on the 23rd of May, looking at single family housing and the operational model for single family housing. So this is the new frontier of build to rent. It's going to be large, and it's going to require very different dynamics to the urban build to rent in many respects, but also a lot of similarities. We're all trying to find out the best way of approaching this. So it should be a fascinating event on the 23rd. And without any further ado, I'd like to thank the panel again. Thank you all for attending and to wish you all a very good day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.